Hey everybody, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor. I'm creating this video actually after I told you my personal story. So if you're seeing this now, I actually recorded this after. So hopefully my mascara is not too smeared from the crying that I did. But before I launch into my story, I wanted to at least provide a brief background on childhood emotional neglect. I will be doing a longer video after this one, not in this one, but after this one, of like 17 specific ways of what childhood abuse and neglect looks like, or specifically child emotional neglect. But I don't want to make this video too long. But I did want to provide some clarity, at least, aside from my story, of kind of what the science and research says about childhood emotional neglect, because that provides some perspective about how damaging this is. There's been, and I'll link it below in the description, so feel free to check the description for all the links. And there's been a 20-year research study that has come out that has shown that childhood emotional neglect does more damage to a developing human being, more damage than physical abuse and sexual abuse. So if that doesn't give you some perspective about how damaging childhood emotional neglect is, it's worse than physical and sexual abuse. So this is a serious, serious wound, and it does some serious damage, as I'll share in my story here briefly. But there's also this amazing quote that literally nails it, just nails it. And so rather than try to summarize it, I'm going to read it exactly as I saw it. And again, I will link this resource below in the description, so feel free to check that out. This particular quote was written in the scientific research literature. Here we go. Emotional neglect can be defined as a relationship pattern in which an individual's affectional needs are consistently disregarded, ignored, invalidated, or unappreciated by a significant other. People in neglectful families are emotionally disconnected from one another, behaving as if they were living on different planets. Parents may have trouble understanding their children's needs for love, affection, closeness, and support, or they may feel too overwhelmed or powerless to meet these needs on a consistent basis. Neglectful parents usually come from families in which, as children, they were ignored or neglected by their parents. They also may lack emotionally satisfying adult relationships, forced to rely on themselves for support, afraid of their own dependency needs, and reluctant to admit their pain. These parents are highly ambivalent about their children's needs, particularly when their children are hurting, crying, or looking for emotional support. They may feel jealous or resentful of their children and may perceive them as excessively demanding and impossible to satisfy. They may be so preoccupied with their own needs that they never consider the children's point of view. Alternatively, they may feel so angry and resentful about having children that they simply ignore them. That is a powerful paragraph that could not be stated more perfectly about what childhood emotional neglect looks like. And so with that, I will now share my story. And I just wanted to wish you all well, because I know this is a difficult topic for many of you. And I apologize for my dog barking. They are always barking at the most inopportune moment, so I apologize if you hear the barking in the next video, or the next section at least. So anyways, without further ado, I'll let you guys listen to my story. Hey everyone, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor. Today I'm going to talk to you about childhood emotional neglect, or CEN, as it's commonly known in the abuse literature. This topic is a difficult one for me. I'm going to be very vulnerable and brave and practice my courage today. And I'm going to share with you my own personal story with one of my parents. I've debated for a long time on whether I would ever be able to tell my story in a more public format. A lot of my clients, have some information, that I've shared with them because I have similar experiences as them. But I've never shared it in a public format. And as many of you survivors can probably relate to, there's a lot of reasons we don't share a story. And not only is it difficult and incredibly painful, but there's fear. There's repercussions if we talk. People have been sued, threatened for speaking out. And victims oftentimes stay silent because of a lot of these fears. And so I have some of those dynamics in my family of origin of secrecy and rug sweeping and not talking about what really happened. And I've lived with these secrets my whole life. It's what propelled me into the field. And, just to give you an idea, I was like 11 or 12 and reading psychology textbooks, like college textbooks, trying to understand the deep sadness that I felt and trying to understand people and my parent. And I knew I wanted to be a therapist as young as age 12. That's how much pain I carried with me from a very young age and even before that. But it was around 11 or 12 that I knew I wanted to do this work that I'm doing. So I've given it a lot of thought, and I told myself, Mary, how can you help other victims be empowered to speak out and to talk about their experiences if you can't do that yourself? So I'm going to practice what I preach, and I'm going to be vulnerable and real and honest, because I do believe survivors need to be empowered to speak about their experiences. In a way, when we grow up in abusive families, we lose our voice, we lose our authenticity. It wasn't safe to be our authentic self. It wasn't safe to use our voice, and so we stay silent. And, the development of all those parts that I talked about in some of my other videos, internal family systems therapy and the parts work that we do as trauma therapists, that's where a lot of my parts came from. And I have a lot of scared parts, as do many trauma survivors. Fear is the basis of a lot of the things that we struggle with. So this is part of my journey, and in a way, it's part of my closure of being able to be open like this. And I really appreciate all of you for taking the time to hear me, to listen. I don't want to cause any pain or harm to any of my living family members. That's not my intention here. In fact, I grieved terribly because I lost all of them through no contact. And I love them. And I think I will always love them. But as we know, when we grow up in families like this, our love for them is not enough to change the dynamics, unfortunately. So I do this not with any intention to harm any living relatives. I do this with the intention to educate and to help other survivors. I remember my journey started really way back many years ago by listening and reading and understanding other survivors' stories. And it was in their stories and their bravery and courage that I began to learn how my own experiences impacted me. And the validation that those stories provided me was immeasurable because, again, gaslighting and invalidation and secret keeping and rug sweeping, that really does a number on our ability to trust ourselves and know ourselves, and to even realize that we do have an authentic voice that deserves to be heard, that is an important voice, just as important as anyone else's in the family. So with all of that in mind, I will share my story. I will not be speaking of any of my living relatives because I can't speak for them or their experiences. I can only speak for mine. My father is deceased, so he is not currently living, and it's been years since he passed away at this point. And I just want to make it clear that I love my father, despite the trauma that I went through. I will always love him. I grieved. My other video that I put out not too long ago was on grief, and grief when they're alive, but I've also grieved his death. And the real truth is that as survivors, we do love our family members, and we suffer. And once you get past the angry stage, you can reach a stage of acceptance where you understand clearly what has happened in your family, and you have like that clarity and the compassion that can enter the picture, and acceptance that nothing we could have done would have changed the outcome, and that we weren't responsible for our family's trauma legacy, and that we are fundamentally a worthy human being, and that we can survive and thrive and have meaningful lives despite our family of origin trauma. So in that spirit, I will share. I grew up with 2 siblings, 2 brothers. I was the only girl. I was also adopted. So in some ways, my first trauma probably was being given up for adoption and having that relationship, biological relationship, severed. And as I grew up, I can just remember always wanting to feel my father's love. I always wanted this man's love. When I was little, he was like a powerful hero to me. I can remember drawing him pictures and artwork for him, making him handmade Father's Day cards and birthday cards, and wanting to spend time with him. But my father, through his own trauma, was not able to meet my needs. And so, hence the childhood emotional neglect that we're getting to. He was a man that was deeply wounded. He grew up with an alcoholic father. I suspect, he hasn't ever talked too much more about his family of origin, but I suspect there were other things like physical abuse and verbal abuse and stuff like that. And he couldn't meet his children's emotional needs because he himself was deeply wounded. And so what it looked like was a parent who was not able to love his children unconditionally, and also incredibly emotionally removed. So I can remember I never really had any one-on-one interactions with my father, like no quality time. He wasn't interested in engaging in quality time with me. I can't speak for my brothers. They may feel differently, and he probably did, quite frankly, engage in different activities with them than he did with me. There were gender dynamics. I always felt like as a girl and as a young woman that he favored my brothers. I don't think he could relate to women, in all honesty. I think there were some wounds there as well. So as a little girl, for example, if he was in the garage, for example, I would go out and be like, oh, hey, Dad, what are you doing? What are you working on? And I always got the sense that he was just busy and didn't have time for me. Sometimes he would tolerate me and I could kind of hang around him a little bit. And then other times, he would say things like, I'm busy, go away. Um, and he was very reclusive. So he always kept to himself. He was either, my memories are really consist of him spending the majority of his time in the back bedroom or in his garage where he liked to tinker. He loved to tinker and build things and make things. And that was kind of where he spent the majority of his time. Very, very individualistic, for example. He didn't have a lot of friends. I don't recall him really hanging out with friends on a frequent basis. He had a couple friends here and there, but it's not like they saw each other frequently. And they had like shared hobbies. My dad loved guns, so that was kind of his hobby. And so really my father's only social support system was my mother. And my mother would be kind of the classic codependent or enabler, as we would say in the psychology field. She had her own wounds from her own family of origin. And I really think she had wounds related to like people pleasing and making sure people remained happy, and denial and rug sweeping and secret keeping. And I think in some ways, my father and her became like a puzzle, a perfect puzzle piece that kind of fit together, that his wounds and her wounds came together in such a way that they were a perfect fit for each other, at least. She really catered to his emotional needs, his physical needs. My mother is also deceased. I always remember she had breakfast and lunch and dinner prepared. So she was that classic stay-at-home mom, made all the dinners, did all the laundry, did all the cooking, cleaning, all the childcare. My father did not do any caregiving duties. That was all my mother. So my only experiences with any type of nurturing interactions was with my mother. I didn't have any with my father. So not only was he kind of reclusive, but he would frequently, when we were younger especially, have very strong rages, and he would get angry, and there would be yelling. Occasionally there was violence, and you always felt like you were walking on eggshells because you didn't know what would set him off. So he could be scary when he was angry, and he didn't have an ability to understand his children's inner world, right? So people who have their own wounds are incapable of understanding people's inner worlds. They're really kind of preoccupied, quite frankly, with their own suffering. And so they don't really have a capacity to be there for other people's suffering. And I'm pretty sure he didn't have insight or understanding into how his behaviors impacted his children, or at least me. I can only talk for myself. I wrote my father several letters, starting when I was a young teenager, and when I was like 18, and when I was a young adult. And these letters I would write, for example, after he would get mad at me for something. And typically it would look like he'd start stonewalling, right? So silent treatment. So he would not speak to me, and I would panic and write him a love letter, explaining myself and talking about my feelings and telling him how much I loved him and wanted the relationship to be better. And he wasn't able to meet my emotional needs. So even though I was very open and forthright and I tried to connect with him, he wasn't capable of connecting with me. So the healed part of me recognizes, this was a very damaged human being that wasn't able to connect. Not that he didn't want to. Maybe he did want to, but that he didn't know how. He was a grown, wounded child, as they say. His emotional and psychological age was probably that of a very young child, actually. So he couldn't meet his children's emotional needs because he was no more than a young child himself, really, emotionally. So the wounds that we grow up with when we have a parent like this is one of invisibility. So we're invisible to our parent. He never asked me about my day, my life, my school progress. I had ballet concerts, for example. He never attended a single ballet concert. I had ballet for 10 years that I participated in. Um, like my accomplishments were not seen. I was not seen. So I think the core wound with childhood emotional neglect is that the child grows up feeling unseen, unheard, unloved, and invisible, like they don't matter. So those core wounds of unworthiness. So those are the wounds I really inherited, which is ironic because no doubt he probably had the same wounds if I had to guess. Some of the last words that I ever spoke with my father was after my mother's death. And he had called a family meeting, and it didn't go well. And I ended up about 2 days later writing him an email saying how much, again, commonality, I'm the one that's reaching out. I'm the one that's authentic and vulnerable and talking about feelings and telling him how much I love him. So same thing, just telling him how much I loved him, that I wanted our relationship to be better, and could we please meet one-on-one? So instead of, with my siblings and him, which ended up being family mobbing, so they ganged up on me, the three of them, after my mom passed. And so the three of them, it was 3 against 1, basically. Not really a fair dynamic, to say the least, especially if you actually want to have some actual real dialogue. And at any rate, I attempted to write him a letter again a couple days later, and his last response to me was that I needed help, that I was crazy, and that I needed to see a therapist. So that was his response to my open-hearted letter. As you can imagine how devastating that was. I was actually a therapist at that time, ironically. And I think that was the last straw. That was the last straw for me. And that was the day that my heart broke permanently. And that was a day that I will never forget. And it was the day that hope died. The day that hope died. And I talked about that in my video on grief. That is something that we as adult children with parents who are highly wounded and have these very disordered behaviors, we go through this grief process of at first being very much in denial of how disordered our parent is, subjugating our own needs and feelings and trying to keep everyone happy, not being our authentic self because it's not safe to be our authentic self. And so there's very much a denial process in the beginning. But then as we start waking up and doing a lot of the research that a lot of us end up doing in our first stages of healing, we start to get pretty angry. We start to see the truth of what has happened, and we get angry. And some people stay in the angry stage. You can tell when survivors have stayed in the angry stage. But then those of us who move past the anger stage, it turns into this, the death of hope, that things will be any different and that we will ever get our needs met and that our parent will ever love us and that anything could ever be any different. And once we grieve the death of hope, that's when the real depression sets in and the sadness and the real crying, like really like heavy crying as you move into the depression and sadness. But then finally, when you're done with the sadness and the depression, you reach a stage of acceptance and you realize your parent could not love you. And not because you were fundamentally unworthy or unlovable. There was never anything wrong with you. It's just that your parent was too wounded to be able to love you. And you reach this deep stage of acceptance. And even eventually, I would say, even after compassion, after acceptance, there is a final stage of even compassion where you can even feel compassion for your parents' suffering, because they are suffering. I have no doubt that my father suffered greatly. People who have these behaviors are not happy inside. And he did end up completing suicide a year later after his last words to me. So I never got to have closure. I never got to have resolution. I tried to mend the fence with my father, so to speak, and he abandoned me. So childhood emotional neglect really is about abandonment. Abandonment of your child's world, of your child's feelings, of your child's needs, of your child's humanity. There is no worse way to tell your child that they don't matter than to treat them like they are invisible and that you don't love them. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. I hope my story is at least validating. I hope you feel that you're not alone, that other people have experienced this great suffering as well. And I hope that my experience can show you that it's possible to go through this and come out the other side. And what the other side looks like is that you don't blame yourself anymore. You understand deeply that you are worthy and unlovable, and that you didn't do anything to deserve your parents' behaviors, and that you can go on and live a meaningful and safe life after the trauma. And so that's really the overall picture of my story, is that I want people to know you can go through hell and such enormous darkness, and it may be hard to see the light, but I'm here to tell you that there is light at the end of that very dark tunnel, and that you can recover, and that you can love yourself, and that you can find meaningful relationships, and that your parents' behaviors had nothing to do with your worthiness as a human being. You're worthy, and you were always worthy. My heart goes out to each and every one of you who have been impacted by this wound. You can get through this. And I'm here to help. And I'll continue to be here on this channel as a support for anybody who's been impacted by this particular wound.